The estate looked different at midnight. Georgia Vall had designed every angle of the restoration to capture moonlight, but she'd never seen it from this perspective before, standing in the gardens as an outsider, watching her own life through a window. She wasn't supposed to be here yet. The flight from Copenhagen had been scheduled for tomorrow morning, but something had pulled her home early. Not intuition exactly. More like the way a building sometimes groans before it collapses, a sound only the architect can hear. The nomination certificate was still in her bag, pressed between folders of presentation materials. The International Design Excellence Award, her third nomination, never a winner, always losing to European legacy firms whose reputations were built on centuries rather than talent. But this time felt different. The committee had asked new questions, looked at her work with fresh attention, seemed to see past the Simone name to the hands that had actually restored these stones. Her hands, her vision, her sleepless nights and breakthrough moments and innovations that people were starting to call revolutionary. The carriage house she'd converted into their home sat dark and empty. She'd texted Andrew from the airport but received no response. Not unusual, he often lost himself in work, especially when she traveled. But the main house blazed with light, specifically the library, her father-in-law's old sanctuary that Andrew rarely entered because it reminded him too much of disappointed expectations and inheritance. Complications. Georgia moved through the gardens she'd planted, past the fountain she'd restored, beneath the archway she'd rebuilt using techniques that were now being studied in preservation programs. Everything here was hers in the way that mattered most. Conception, execution, vision made tangible. But her name appeared smaller with each passing season, while Simone architectural heritage appeared larger on every plaque. Every publication, every award submission. She told herself it was marriage, collaboration, building, something together meaning neither person needed. Their name prominent because the work spoke for itself. The library. Window was open, despite the cool autumn night. Voices drifted out, and Georgia stopped walking, stopped breathing, became absolutely still in the way prey animals freeze when they sense the predator circling. The sustainable plaster technique is the real innovation, a woman's voice, confident and polished. If we can patent the application process, it positions us as industry leaders for the next generation of restoration work. Walk me through it again. Andrew's voice. The tone he used when he wanted someone to feel important, valued, seen. The tone Georgia had fallen in love with before she understood it was a tool he deployed rather than an authentic expression. The base compound uses reclaimed materials. Here, I've detailed the mixture ratios. Paper rustled. Then the application happens in layers, each one bonding to the historic plaster beneath without degrading the original surface. It's brilliant because it's both preservation and innovation simultaneously. Georgia's vision narrowed. Those were her drawings, her formulas, her breakthrough technique developed over 18 months of failed experiments in the Philadelphia church restoration. Before she'd ever met Andrew, before the Simone name had attached itself to everything she touched. Bethany, this is exceptional work. Lillian Simone's voice cut through the night with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms and people and narratives. Truly exceptional. This is exactly the kind of institutional innovation we need, not individual ego, but something that belongs to the legacy itself. Georgia moved closer to the window, staying in shadows, watching three people bent over her life's work like surgeons over a body they were preparing to dissect. The woman, Bethany, was probably close to Georgia's age, though it was hard to tell. Blonde hair in a style that suggested expensive salons, clothing that whispered old money rather than shouted it, the kind of polished presentation that made people instinctively trust institutional credibility. She stood where Georgia should be standing, in the space Georgia had occupied countless times, presenting ideas to Andrew and his mother, hoping for approval that came less frequently as the seasons passed. The patent applications should be filed under the company's institutional research division. Lillian continued, her finger tracing something on the drawings. We've had issues before with individual architects claiming proprietary rights to techniques developed on our property, using our resources. Better to establish clear ownership from the beginning. Of course, Bethany nodded, eager and compliant in ways Georgia had never mastered. Everything I develop here belongs to the Simone legacy. That's the whole point of institutional architecture, building something that outlasts any individual contributor. Andrew leaned back in his father's leather chair, the same chair where Thomas Simone had sat, while telling his son he'd never amount to anything worthwhile, that the family name was wasted on someone with more charm than substance. Georgia had heard the stories, had held Andrew through nights when his father's disappointment haunted him like a ghost that wouldn't release its grip. "It's refreshing," Andrew said, and Georgia heard genuine relief in his voice, working with someone who understands the bigger picture. Some people get too attached to individual recognition, like their name matters more than the work itself. Prima donnas, Lillian agreed. They confuse collaboration with ownership, partnership with servitude. It's exhausting, frankly. They want credit for every idea, every breakthrough, as if architecture is a solitary pursuit rather than an institutional endeavor. Georgia's hands clenched around the strap of her bag. The nomination certificate inside suddenly felt like evidence of a crime she hadn't known she was committing. The crime of wanting her name on work that came from her mind, her hands, her refusal to sleep until she'd solved problems other architects considered unsolvable. "I think we should move forward with bringing Bethany on as principal restoration architect," Lillian said. "Georgia has been useful, certainly, but her contract is coming up for renewal, and I think we need someone more aligned with the family's long-term vision." The word useful landed like a blow. Georgia had been called many things in her career: brilliant, innovative, uncompromising, difficult, but never useful. Never a tool to be deployed and discarded when its purpose was served. "We should wait until after the inheritance situation is settled," Andrew said quietly. "We don't want any complications. The timeline is tight," Lillian acknowledged, "but doable. Another season at most, then we can make the transition smoothly. In the meantime, Bethany can shadow Georgia on remaining projects, learn her methods, prepare to take over seamlessly." Shadow her. Learn her methods. Take over. The words assembled themselves into a narrative Georgia hadn't seen coming, though perhaps she should have. The way her credit had been shrinking on project materials. The way Andrew scheduled meetings without her, made decisions about her designs without consulting her, spoke about the estate restoration as our vision in a way that somehow excluded the person who'd actually done the envisioning. "The drawings are locked in her studio," Andrew continued. "But I have access. I've been documenting her process, her techniques, everything we need to continue the work after she's gone." Gone, not transitioned, not moved to other projects, gone. Bethany gathered the papers, Georgia's papers, her formulas, her innovations, and smiled with the confidence of someone who believed she'd earned what she was receiving. "I won't let you down. The Simone legacy deserves architects who understand that the institution is what matters, not individual ambition." Georgia backed away from the window, her footsteps silent on grass she'd planted, past beds she'd designed, beneath trees she'd saved from disease through research and determination, and love for living things that couldn't speak for themselves. The nomination certificate crumpled in her grip. She'd been so excited to share the news, to tell Andrew that the committee had noticed her work, that international recognition was finally coming, that all the late nights and sacrifices and compromises were leading somewhere worth going. But he already knew where she was leading. Toward her own disappearance. Carefully orchestrated, systematically executed, her name shrinking while his expanded to fill the space she'd carved out with her own hands. Georgia walked to the carriage house, unlocked the door, stepped into the home she'd designed to capture morning light and afternoon warmth and evening peace. She set down her bag but didn't turn on the lights. In darkness, she could see the estate through the windows, her restoration, her innovation, her revolution in sustainable preservation techniques, all of it about to be credited to someone who'd learned it by studying. Georgia like a subject to be mastered and replicated. She pulled out her phone and looked at Andrew's last text. Sent while she was presenting in Copenhagen. Miss you. Can't wait to see what you've accomplished. Accomplished. Past tense. As if whatever she'd achieved was already finished, already extracted, already ready to be transferred to more appropriate hands. Georgia sat on the floor in the dark and understood with perfect clarity that she'd spent years building her own prison, and the architects of her confinement had convinced her she was building a home. The question wasn't whether to fight back. The question was whether there was anything left of herself to fight with, or if they'd already taken everything that mattered. Her phone buzzed. Andrew, when does your flight get in tomorrow? I'll pick you up. She stared at the message for a long time before typing, don't bother. I'll find my own way home. But she was already home. That was the problem. She'd been home the whole time, watching strangers move through her life, preparing to live in it after she was gone. Chapter 2. The Archaeology of Lies. Georgia didn't sleep. Sleep required the ability to close your eyes without seeing Bethany Crane holding papers covered in your handwriting, without hearing your husband discuss your usefulness in the past tense, without feeling the foundation of your life crumbling beneath weight it was never designed to carry. Instead, she became an archaeologist. She'd restored dozens of historic structures by excavating their histories layer by layer, understanding that buildings hide their truths beneath surfaces that later generations paint over, or modify, or try to erase entirely. Her own life, she realized, required the same methodical examination. She needed to dig through years of accumulated assumptions, remove the decorative lies, and expose the structural betrayal beneath. The studio safe stood in the corner, an antique piece she'd restored herself, its combination known only to two people. Georgia opened it expecting violation, but finding instead something worse, meticulous care. Whoever had accessed her drawings had been careful to replace everything precisely, to leave no obvious evidence of intrusion. Only the internal mechanism betrayed repeated access. Tiny scratches on tumblers that shouldn't show wear. She'd given Andrew the combination during the first year of their marriage, after her mother died suddenly, and Georgia realized she had no family left to notify in emergencies, no one to access important documents if something happened to her. Andrew had held her while she cried, had promised he'd protect everything that mattered to her, had made her feel safe in ways she hadn't felt since childhood. That promise felt different now. Protection and possession, she understood, could look identical from certain angles. Georgia pulled out her archives, original sketches, research notes, correspondence with material suppliers, and historic preservation boards, dated documentation of every innovation she'd developed. The sustainable plaster technique Bethany had presented so confidently dated back to the Philadelphia church restoration, completed months before Georgia met Andrew. She had proof. Purchase orders for experimental materials, emails with chemists discussing compound ratios, photographs of failed attempts, and eventual breakthrough. Her laptop revealed deeper archaeology. Their shared computer held folders Georgia rarely examined because she trusted Andrew with administrative work, trusted him to handle the business side of their partnership while she focused on actual architecture. That trust looked different now, not partnership but division of labor that allowed him access to everything while she remained deliberately blind to warning signs. She found a folder labeled Strategic Development buried inside tax documents. Inside were files spanning multiple years, organized with someone's careful attention to long-term planning. The earliest documents were innocent: company growth projections, potential client lists, market analysis. Then the tone shifted. A file from approximately 2 years ago, titled Brand Refinement Strategy, outlined plans to strengthen the Simone institutional identity by de-emphasizing individual architect attribution. The document suggested that clients and media had become too focused on Georgia Voll as a personality, rather than understanding her work as part of the Simone heritage. It proposed gradually minimizing her name in promotional materials, emphasizing company methodology over individual innovation, and repositioning their public image around legacy and institution rather than contemporary talent. Georgia's name appeared in quotation marks throughout, as if she were a concept to be managed rather than a person who existed. Another file contained spreadsheets tracking her project timeline, noting when each major commission would be completed, calculating how much value her work added to the Simone portfolio, projecting when the company would have extracted sufficient intellectual property and reputation enhancement to function independently of her continued employment. Extracted. The word appeared multiple times. Extracting value. Maximizing extraction period. Ensuring complete extraction before transition. She was a resource. A vein of ore to be mined until depleted, then abandoned when the digging stopped producing valuable material. The most recent documents were even more explicit. A file labeled Succession Planning detailed the recruitment and preparation of Bethany Crane. It included her background, prestigious architecture program, family connections to old money preservation societies, aesthetic that photographed well for marketing materials, and a timeline for integration. Bethany would shadow Georgia on remaining projects, absorbing her techniques while building relationships with Georgia's professional contacts. When the transition occurred, Bethany would be positioned to take over seamlessly, presenting continuity to clients, while actually representing a complete replacement of the creative force behind their recent success. Georgia found email chains between Andrew and his mother, casual in their cruelty. Georgia is becoming difficult about attribution, Andrew had written. She wanted her name listed first on the Historical Society award submission. I explained that institutional recognition is more valuable than individual credit, but she's becoming increasingly insistent about personal achievement. Lillian's response: this is exactly why we need to accelerate the transition timeline. Prima donna architects are impossible to manage once they believe they're irreplaceable. We need Bethany fully trained before Georgia realizes how little leverage she actually has. Another exchange, more recent. How much longer do we need her? Andrew asked. The inheritance situation resolves soon, Lillian replied. Once that's settled, the estate is ours completely, including all intellectual property developed on the grounds. Everything Georgia has created here becomes legally ours. After that, she's no longer essential. Bethany can take over, and we can finally move forward with someone who understands her place in the larger institutional picture. Georgia read the words 3 times. 4 times, unable to process the casual dismissal, the reduction of her life's work to a legal technicality to be exploited. But it was the final document that destroyed something fundamental in her chest. An audio file, unlabeled, buried in a subfolder within a subfolder. She almost didn't open it, almost closed the laptop, and walked away from archaeology that was excavating wounds rather than truths. But she'd learned in restoration work that you can't stop halfway through demolition. You have to see the whole structure, understand the complete damage, before you can begin rebuilding. She clicked play. Lillian's voice filled the studio. We've extracted everything useful from this marriage. Georgia served her purpose, her talent, her award potential, her professional network, her innovative techniques. Now we have it all documented, learned, ready to be reproduced by someone more appropriate. Andrew's voice, hesitant but compliant. She's going to fight the transition. She's not as passive as Bethany. Then we make it clear she has no choice. Everything she's created here was developed using our resources, on our property, under our company umbrella. Legally, it belongs to us. If she challenges that, we bury her in litigation until she gives up. Besides, who's going to believe her? We're the Simone family. We've been in preservation architecture for generations. She's just another talented architect we gave opportunities to, who became ungrateful and started making unreasonable demands. Laughter. They were laughing. She really thought you loved her, Lillian said, amusement clear in her voice. Silence from Andrew. Long enough that Georgia leaned forward, waiting for him to defend her, to correct his mother, to say something that would complicate this narrative of complete betrayal. I needed her, he finally said. My father's will, the inheritance requirements, the timeline pressure. I needed someone brilliant enough to restore the estate and salvage our reputation. Georgia was perfect, desperate for belonging after her mother died, financially vulnerable, talented beyond anything I could have faked. I gave her security and status. She gave me legitimacy and value. That's not love, but it's not nothing either. It's extraction, Lillian said, pure and simple, and it worked beautifully. Now we replace her with someone less complicated, and we move forward. The recording ended. Georgia sat in her studio, surrounded by evidence of systematic theft, listening to silence that felt louder than any confession, and understood that she'd been living inside someone else's architecture the entire time. Andrew had designed their relationship with the same calculation she used designing buildings, every element serving a specific purpose, every gesture calculated for maximum structural integrity, every moment of apparent intimacy actually just another support beam in a construction meant to hold only until the foundation was fully extracted. She'd thought she was building a marriage. He'd been building a mine. Outside, dawn began breaking over the estate she'd restored, and Georgia Voll started planning the most important project of her career, the complete demolition of everything Andrew Simone had tried to build on the bones of her stolen work. Chapter 3. The Performance. Iris Smith arrived before noon, driving from Boston without hesitation when Georgia called and said nothing except, "I need you to see something. Bring your legal expertise and don't tell anyone where you're going." They'd met in graduate school, two women who'd built their careers through relentless competence in fields that still questioned whether women belonged in positions requiring authority. Iris had fought her way through law school as the daughter of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything for her education. Georgia had fought through architecture programs where professors praised her work while suggesting she'd be happier in interior design. They understood each other's particular species of exhaustion. Iris examined the documents in silence, her expression hardening with each new piece of evidence. She read emails, reviewed spreadsheets, listened to the recording while taking notes in the precise handwriting that made juries trust her completely. "This is actionable," she finally said. "Intellectual property theft, systematic credit fraud, potentially constructive fraud regarding your marital property rights. The recording alone is devastating. Can we win?" "Georgia," Iris looked up from the laptop, "this isn't about winning or losing. This is about whether you want to burn everything down or try to negotiate some kind of settlement that preserves your dignity while minimizing public damage." "I want to burn it all down," Georgia said. "Every lie, every theft, every moment he stood beside me and let people think he was the architect when he was just the thief. I want it gone. Then we need strategy, not rage. Rage gets you counterattacked and buried in litigation you can't afford. Strategy gets you vindication." They spent the day building Georgia's case, approaching it like a restoration project, carefully documenting every layer, preserving evidence, preparing for the demolition to come. Iris made calls to colleagues in intellectual property law, to forensic accountants who could trace financial benefit from Georgia's appropriated work, to investigators who could document the systematic credit erosion in public materials. "You need to keep performing," Iris said as afternoon stretched toward evening. "Act normal. Don't let them know you're aware of anything. The longer they think you're oblivious, the more evidence they'll generate." "I don't know if I can do that." "Be around him. Pretend everything is fine. You're an architect. You've spent years building things that don't collapse under pressure. Build one more thing, a performance that lasts just long enough for us to finish preparing your demolition." So Georgia performed. Andrew came home that evening with takeout from her favorite restaurant, apologizing for missing her arrival, saying he'd been buried in work. She smiled and kissed him and asked about his day, and watched him lie about meetings that never happened, research that was actually her research, problems he was solving that were actually problems she'd solved months ago. "How was Copenhagen?" he asked, opening wine, settling into the domestic routine they'd built together over years that now felt like elaborate theater. The nomination process was intense. They asked difficult questions about methodology and innovation. She watched his face for reaction. Nothing visible. Years of practice had made him excellent at concealment. They wanted to understand exactly how the sustainable plaster technique was developed, who contributed what, how individual innovation connects to institutional support. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I developed the core technique independently during the Philadelphia church restoration before I joined the Simone Company. That the applications here at the estate were refinements of my original innovation." Andrew's hand paused slightly on his wine glass. Barely noticeable, just a tiny hesitation that told Georgia the truth had consequences he wasn't prepared for. "We should probably coordinate our messaging about the estate project," he said carefully. "Make sure we're presenting a consistent narrative about collaboration and partnership. The work we've done together, the shared vision, the unified approach." "Of course," Georgia said. "We should absolutely coordinate what we tell people about who did what." Over the following days, she attended company functions, smiled through dinners with Andrew's colleagues, allowed herself to be introduced as Andrew's talented wife rather than correcting the power dynamic that implied she was an accessory to his career rather than the engine driving. Their recent success. She met Bethany Crane at a Simone Foundation charity event, an evening of expensive wine and careful networking where preservation donors mingled with architects seeking commissions, and everyone performed the elaborate dance of appearing interested while actually calculating professional advantage. Bethany approached Georgia with champagne and compliments. "I've been studying your work on the estate restoration. The sustainable techniques you developed are absolutely groundbreaking." "Thank you," Georgia said, noting the careful phrasing. "Techniques you developed rather than we developed together or the Simone Company created." Bethany knew exactly what she was saying, establishing from the beginning that she recognized individual authorship, even as she prepared to claim it. "I'd love to learn more about your process. Andrew mentioned you might be willing to mentor someone interested in historic preservation methodology." Mentor. The word people used when they meant teach me everything you know so I can replace you. "I'm always happy to share knowledge with people who are genuinely interested in the work itself rather than just the recognition it brings," Georgia said. Bethany's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, awareness that the comment had layers, that this conversation was happening on multiple levels simultaneously. They talked about restoration philosophy, about the tension between preserving historic integrity and introducing modern sustainability, about whether architects owed their loyalty to the buildings they restored or the clients who hired them. Bethany was intelligent, Georgia had to admit. Well-trained, articulate, capable of discussing complex concepts with genuine understanding. In another context, they might have been colleagues, even friends. But in this context, Bethany was the woman being positioned to wear George's career like a stolen coat. The cruelest moment came near the end of the evening, when a prominent museum director approached and complimented Andrew on the estate restoration. "The work is extraordinary, truly innovative. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished." Andrew accepted the praise graciously, gesturing toward Georgia. "I couldn't have done it without Georgia's support and contribution. She's been invaluable. Invaluable support, contribution." The words erased her authorship while appearing generous. The museum director smiled at Georgia with the polite acknowledgement people give assistants and spouses, then returned his attention to Andrew, discussing future projects and collaboration opportunities that would clearly involve the Simone Company, with Andrew as the primary contact. Georgia watched her professional identity dissolve in real time, observed Andrew allowing the misunderstanding to perpetuate, noticed that he never once corrected the assumption that he was the architect and she was merely involved. That night, he reached for her in bed with tenderness that once felt like intimacy, but now felt like strategy. He whispered that she was brilliant, that he was proud of her, that they were building something remarkable together. "Do you love me?" she asked in the darkness. "Of course I love you." "How do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of question is that?" "I'm serious. How do you know what you feel is love and not just something else? Need, maybe, dependency, habit. Georgia, where is this coming from?" She didn't answer. Couldn't answer without revealing that she'd excavated their entire foundation and found it hollow. Instead, she turned away, felt his arm come around her waist, and understood that some performances require you to allow yourself to be held by someone who's already let you go. In the morning, legal documents arrived. Iris had been busy. Georgia now had forensic documentation of her intellectual property, expert testimony prepared, financial analysis showing how her work had increased the Simone Company's value, and a legal strategy that would either force settlement or create the most public destruction of reputation the architecture world had seen in years. She looked at Andrew across the breakfast table, watching him read the news and drink coffee and exist in their shared space as if nothing had fundamentally shifted, and thought about the difference between loving someone and being willing to destroy them. She was about to find out if she could do both simultaneously. Chapter 4. The Inheritance. The Simone family attorney's office occupied the top floor of a building in downtown Manhattan, all dark wood and leather, furniture and the particular smell of inherited wealth, old, books and expensive cologne and the confidence that comes from never having to prove your worth. Marcus Whitfield had handled Simone illegal affairs since before Andrew was born. He greeted Georgia with paternal condescension, the kind of benevolent dismissal powerful men offer women they consider decorative rather than dangerous. "Mrs. Simone, what a lovely surprise. Andrew didn't mention you'd be joining us for the estate planning discussion." "He doesn't know I'm here," Georgia said, settling into the leather chair across from his massive desk. "I wanted to understand our legal situation independently before making any decisions about updated documents." Whitfield's smile became slightly strained. Women asking questions always made men like him uncomfortable. It disrupted the natural order where they explained, and women gratefully accepted explanation. Of course. Though I should mention that anything we discuss regarding the estate falls under attorney-client privilege, with Andrew as the primary. I'm not asking you to violate privilege. I'm asking you to explain my own legal rights regarding property and intellectual property created during our marriage." She watched him calculate, trying to determine if she was a concerned wife seeking clarity or something more complicated. He chose to treat her as the former, which meant he underestimated her completely. "Well, as you know, New York is an equitable distribution state. which means marital property is divided fairly in the event of divorce, though fair doesn't necessarily mean equal. However, in your case, there are some unique considerations, such as the Simone estate itself is held in a complex trust structure established by Andrew's father, Thomas. The terms of that trust include certain performance requirements for Andrew to inherit fully. Georgia leaned forward slightly. Performance requirements? Whitfield hesitated, clearly uncertain how much to reveal. But his pride in legal complexity overcame his discretion. He wanted to explain the clever structure Thomas Simone had created, wanted to demonstrate his own role in maintaining it. Thomas was concerned about Andrew's ability to maintain the family's architectural reputation. He created a will provision requiring Andrew to demonstrate successful management of the estate within a certain time frame after Thomas's death. If Andrew failed to meet those requirements, the majority of the estate would transfer to a preservation trust rather than to Andrew directly. Demonstrate successful management how? Profitable operations, positive media attention, significant restoration work that enhanced the property's value and reputation. The kind of measurable success that would prove Andrew could be trusted with the family legacy. Georgia felt something cold settle in her chest. When does this evaluation period end? Soon, actually. Thomas gave Andrew several years to prove himself, and the deadline approaches. She understood then, with perfect clarity, the architecture of her entire marriage. Andrew hadn't hunted her specifically, he'd been desperate. His father had created an impossible test, knowing Andrew lacked the talent to pass it, creating a final judgment from beyond the grave. Andrew had needed someone brilliant enough to save him, and Georgia had arrived at exactly the right moment. Talented, vulnerable after her mother's death, hungry for belonging and family and purpose. And if Andrew meets the requirements, then he inherits the estate completely, including all intellectual property and business assets associated with the property. Everything created here becomes his, legally and permanently. Everything created here, Georgia repeated slowly, including architectural innovations developed by people working on the estate. Correct. The trust structure is quite comprehensive. Any architectural methodology, design innovation, or proprietary technique developed while living and working on estate property becomes part of the asset base that Andrew inherits. Georgia sat very still, processing the magnitude of the trap she'd walked into. Andrew hadn't just stolen her work. He'd structured their entire life together to make that theft legal. Every innovation she'd developed in her studio, every technique she'd created while living in the carriage house, every breakthrough achieved on estate grounds, all of it would become his property the moment he satisfied his father's inheritance requirements. She'd built the tools of her own dispossession. "Thank you for explaining this so clearly," she said, standing to leave. "Of course, Mrs. Simone, and please don't hesitate to contact me if you have concerns about estate planning. It's important that you understand your position in all of this." My position, Georgia thought, walking out of his office. He meant my subordinate position, my status as someone whose contributions can be legally erased, whose work can be appropriated, whose identity can be dissolved into someone else's inheritance. She called Iris from the street. "We have a bigger problem than I thought. Tell me." Georgia explained the inheritance structure, the timeline, the legal framework designed to transform her innovations into Andrew's property. Iris was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she finally said. "This is complicated but not impossible. Your sustainable plaster technique was developed before you married Andrew, before you ever lived on the estate. That remains yours regardless of the inheritance provision. We can argue that any subsequent work is derivative of your prior innovation rather than new creation, which means it stays yours intellectually, even if physically executed on his property. Will that argument work? It will work better if we move quickly, before the inheritance deadline passes and everything gets locked into legal structures that are harder to challenge. We need to establish your independent ownership now, publicly and unambiguously, before Andrew inherits and tries to claim everything under estate assets. How do we do that? We make you famous in your own right, separate from the Simone name. We establish your reputation so clearly and publicly that any attempt to claim your work as his becomes obviously fraudulent. Georgia thought about the Copenhagen nomination, the international committee that had been asking careful questions about individual contribution versus institutional credit. She thought about Bethany Crane being positioned as her replacement. She thought about Andrew's casual dismissal of her need for individual recognition, his insistence that institutional legacy mattered more than personal achievement. "I know how to do it," she said, "but it's going to destroy everything." "Everything is already destroyed," Iris said quietly. "You just didn't know you were living in ruins. Now you're going to tear down the facade and show everyone what's underneath." Georgia returned to the estate that evening and found Andrew in the library, working at his father's desk, surrounded by papers that were probably stolen from her studio. He smiled when she entered, genuine warmth in his expression, and she wondered if he even recognized his own performance anymore, or if he'd been pretending for so long that pretending had become authentic. "How was your day?" he asked, the question every spouse asks, meaningless and profound simultaneously. "Illuminating," she said. "I learned a lot about legal structures and inheritance, provisions, and what happens to people's work when it's created on someone else's property." Something flickered across his face, brief, alarm quickly suppressed. "That sounds specific. I'm just trying to understand our situation better, making sure I know what belongs to me legally, what belongs to us, what belongs to your family's trust structure." "Everything we've built together belongs to both of us," Andrew said, which wasn't an answer. "We're partners, Georgia. What I have is yours." She wanted to ask if the reverse was true, if what she had was actually hers, or if he'd already claimed it in legal documents and inheritance structures she hadn't been shown. But asking would reveal too much too soon. Better to let him believe she was still performing the role of devoted wife, still blind to the architecture of her dispossession. "I love you," she said instead, testing the words, trying to determine if they still held any truth or if they'd become hollow sounds that meant nothing beyond strategic deployment. "I love you too," he replied, and she genuinely couldn't tell if he meant it. That night, she drafted her Copenhagen presentation, not the safe version about restoration techniques and sustainable methodology, the dangerous version that would either establish her independent reputation or destroy her career completely. She chose danger. Safety had gotten her stolen, erased, legally dispossessed of her own genius. Danger might at least let her go down fighting. Chapter 5. The Architect's Blueprint. Georgia worked in secret, building her case the way she built buildings, foundation first, then structure, then the finishing details that transformed engineering into art. She met Iris in Boston to avoid any possibility of Andrew discovering their planning. Iris had assembled a team, intellectual property specialists, forensic accountants, investigators who could document systematic credit theft in ways that would hold up in legal proceedings. "The key is establishing your independent reputation before the inheritance deadline," Iris explained, spreading documents across her dining room table. "Once that passes, and the estate becomes legally his, it gets infinitely harder to challenge his claims on your work. We have months, not years. Then we work fast." They documented everything. Georgia's original designs, dated and notarized, purchase orders for materials she'd bought during the Philadelphia church restoration, proving she'd developed the sustainable plaster technique before ever meeting Andrew. Correspondence with chemical suppliers and materials experts, emails discussing her experimental process, photographs of failed attempts and eventual breakthrough. The forensic accountants traced how Georgia's innovations had increased the Simone company's value, calculating that her work had generated millions in new commissions and reputation enhancement. They documented how her name had been systematically minimized in promotional materials over time, showing clear intent to erase her contribution while retaining the financial benefit of her reputation. The investigators did something even more valuable. They found other people. Former Simone Company employees willing to testify about being pressured to minimize Georgia's credit in materials. Journalists who'd been asked to reframe articles to emphasize Andrew's leadership rather than Georgia's creativity. Industry colleagues who'd witnessed Andrew accepting praise for work Georgia designed while she stood silently beside him. Most devastatingly, they found documentation of the business development strategy meetings where Lillian and Andrew had explicitly discussed extracting Georgia's value before replacing her. Meeting notes, email chains, calendar appointments labeled GV Transition Strategy with attendees that never included Georgia herself. "This is more than we need for a legal case," Iris said, reviewing the evidence. "This is enough to destroy his reputation publicly." "Good," Georgia said. "I don't want a quiet settlement. I want everyone to know what he did. You understand there's no going back from this? Once you make this public, your marriage is over. Your relationship with the Simone family is over. Some people will call you vindictive or bitter or a woman scorned, trying to destroy her husband. Let them. I'd rather be called vindictive than erased." The Copenhagen Award Committee reached out during this period. Georgia hadn't won the award. It had gone to a Danish firm working on medieval cathedral restoration, but the committee wanted her to present at the International Symposium anyway. They were creating a special session on innovative restoration techniques, and they wanted Georgia to discuss her sustainable methodology. "We've been impressed by your work," the committee chair, Valentina Reyes, told her during a video call. "But we've also noticed some concerning patterns in how your contributions are attributed in various materials. This is a common problem for women architects, particularly those working within family firms or legacy institutions. We'd like to give you a platform to present your work in your own voice, establishing clear authorship." "You want me to make a case for myself?" Valentina smiled. "We want you to show the world what you've actually accomplished, separate from institutional claims. What you do with that platform is your decision." Georgia understood what was being offered, not just presentation time, but an audience of the world's most influential architects and preservation experts gathered in one place, prepared to listen. A stage large enough that whatever she said couldn't be minimized or buried or reframed later. She accepted immediately. Andrew was enthusiastic when she told him about the presentation opportunity, already planning to attend with his mother and Bethany, already positioning himself to network with European contacts who might be valuable for company expansion. "This is wonderful," he said. "Great exposure for the company." "For me," Georgia corrected gently. "Great exposure for me. The invitation was specifically for my individual work, not company representation." Of course. But everything you've accomplished reflects well on the institutional support that made it possible, right? We succeed together." She let him believe that. Let him think she was still performing the role of grateful wife, whose success was actually their shared achievement. Let him make plans to attend, to sit in the audience, to watch her present work he thought he owned. Meanwhile, she prepared the presentation that would dismantle him. She spent weeks building it with the same meticulous care she brought to restoration projects. Every slide had documentation. Every claim had evidence. Every innovation was traced to its origin point, showing clearly and irrefutably that the work had come from her mind, her hands. Her refusal to accept that historic preservation required choosing between honoring the past and building sustainable futures. The most difficult part was deciding how personal to make it. She could present purely professional evidence, the credits, the chronology, the systematic erasure. That would be enough to establish her reputation and challenge Andrew's claims. But purely professional didn't address the deeper betrayal. The marriage built on extraction, the love that might have been real or might have been desperate need so convincing that neither of them could distinguish it from authentic feeling. Iris advised caution. Personal accusations make you look emotional rather than credible. Stick to professional claims. But Valentina, during a planning call, said something different. Women are always told to separate personal and professional, as if our lives can be divided into neat categories that don't touch each other. But theft is theft, whether it happens in an office or a marriage bed. If you want to tell the whole truth, tell it. The architecture community needs to understand that this kind of exploitation doesn't just happen in business transactions. It happens in relationships where power is disguised as partnership. Georgia made her decision. She would tell the whole truth. She moved her essential belongings out of the carriage house gradually, taking only what she'd brought to the marriage or created independently. Her grandmother's drafting tools, antique and irreplaceable. Her mother's architectural books, margins filled with notes that Georgia had read during the chemotherapy appointments, trying to memorize her mother's handwriting before death erased it. Original sketches from her early career, the work that had established her reputation before Andrew attached himself to it. She rented a small apartment in Brooklyn under her maiden name, Vol, not Simone. The apartment was tiny compared to the carriage house, but it was entirely hers. No shared space, no compromised territory, no rooms where she had to negotiate between her needs and someone else's comfort. She opened new bank accounts, separated her finances, began the careful work of disentangling herself from joint assets and shared debts. Iris helped her understand what she legally owned versus what would be contested, what was unambiguously hers versus what Andrew might try to claim through inheritance provisions or marital property arguments. The sustainable plaster technique remained unambiguously hers, developed before marriage, before estate residence, documented extensively. That was her leverage, her foundation, the one thing he couldn't take no matter how clever his father's legal structures had been. Everything else could be fought over, would be fought over, but that one innovation, the breakthrough that had made her internationally notable, the technique that was revolutionizing historic preservation work that belonged to her alone, and no inheritance provision could change it. The night before leaving for Copenhagen, Georgia sat in the carriage house one final time. Andrew was at a business dinner, networking with potential clients, performing the role of successful architect while his actual talent remained mysterious and undemonstrated. She walked through rooms she'd designed, touching walls she'd painted, looking through windows she'd positioned to capture specific qualities of light. This had been home, or she'd thought it was home. Now she understood it had been a stage where she performed the role of wife while Andrew extracted everything valuable before replacing her with someone more manageable. She left her key on the kitchen counter with a note, "Gone to Copenhagen early. Need some time alone to prepare. See you at the symposium." She didn't say she loved him, couldn't bring herself to write words that might be true, or might be habit, or might be the ghost of feeling that had died without her noticing, leaving only the outline where love used to be. On the flight to Copenhagen, she reviewed her presentation one final time. Every slide was perfect. Every piece of evidence was documented. Every claim was defensible. The final slide simply read, "Architecture is about building things that last. But you cannot build anything real on stolen ground." She closed her laptop and looked out at clouds illuminated by sunrise, thinking about the difference between demolition and collapse. Collapse happens to you, sudden, catastrophic, beyond your control. Demolition is something you do deliberately, carefully removing what can't be saved, clearing ground for something new. She was about to demolish her marriage, her connection to the Simone family, possibly her entire career if this went badly. But she was doing it deliberately, with precision and planning, because collapse was happening anyway, and she refused to go down without choosing the terms of her own destruction. The symposium was waiting. The audience was gathering. The stage was set. Time to tear it all down and see what remained when the lies stopped holding up the structure. Chapter 6. The Exhibition. The Copenhagen Symposium Hall was converted industrial architecture. Steel and glass and exposed brick that spoke of a building finding new purpose while honoring its original bones. Georgia appreciated the metaphor as she stood backstage, listening to the moderator introduce her session on innovative restoration techniques. 500 people filled the auditorium. The most influential architects, historians, and preservation experts in the world gathered for a week of presentations and networking and the careful dance of professional reputation. Georgia had attended these symposiums before, always as Andrew's wife, always standing slightly behind him, always introduced as Georgia Vol Simone, who contributed significantly to the estate project. Today she would be just Georgia Vol, and she would contribute nothing except the complete truth. Andrew sat in the third row, positioned perfectly to be visible and associated with her presentation without being intrusive. His mother occupied the seat beside him, elegant and composed, already networking with the German Preservation Society director sitting to her left. Bethany Crane sat one row back, taking notes, prepared to learn whatever techniques Georgia might reveal so she could deploy them once the replacement was complete. They had no idea what was coming. Valentina Reyes, the committee chair who'd invited Georgia, introduced her with unusual specificity. Our next presenter has been nominated for the International Design Excellence Award multiple times, and while the committee has not yet granted her that recognition, we believe her work represents some of the most innovative thinking in contemporary historic preservation. Please welcome Georgia Vol, who will present on sustainable restoration methodology and the complex questions of authorship, attribution, and institutional credit in collaborative architectural practice. The last phrase, authorship and attribution, made Andrew shift slightly in his seat. Georgia watched him try to catch her eye, looking for reassurance. She didn't provide it, she took the stage. "Thank you for that introduction," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "And thank you for specifically using my professional name, Vol, not Simone, because that distinction is going to matter in the next hour." A ripple moved through the audience. This was already not a standard technical presentation. Georgia advanced to her first slide, a stunning photograph of the Simone estate after restoration. Golden hour light making the stone walls glow, gardens in full bloom, every element perfect. "This is the project that earned me 3 International Design Excellence Award nominations. This is the work that's been featured in architectural journals, preservation magazines, and museum exhibitions. This is the restoration that's being studied in programs around the world." She paused, letting them appreciate the image. "And this is the project that almost erased me completely." She clicked to the next slide, a comparison showing promotional materials from 3 years ago versus current materials. In the early versions, her name appeared in large type as principal architect, with Simone architectural heritage noted as institutional support. In the current versions, her name had shrunk to fine print, while Simone architectural heritage dominated the attribution. This is systematic erasure. This is what happens when institutions decide that individual creativity threatens the legacy brand. This is what happened to me while I was married to the man sitting in the third row, who allowed it to happen because my genius was more valuable to him than my identity. Andrew's face drained of color. Lillian's hand gripped his arm. Bethany looked mortified. Georgia didn't stop. She showed her original drawings for the estate restoration, each one dated and notarized, proving they were created before her marriage. She displayed the sustainable plaster technique that had revolutionized the project, then showed her patent application filed years earlier during the Philadelphia church restoration, demonstrating that this innovation was entirely hers. Developed before Andrew existed in her professional life, she presented the business development strategic plan documents, the emails discussing extraction and replacement, the calendar appointments scheduling her systematic dispossession. She showed the timeline for recruiting and training Bethany Crane to take over once Georgia had served her purpose. "This is Bethany Crane," Georgia said, advancing to a photograph of Bethany in Georgia's studio, touching Georgia's tools, studying Georgia's workspace. "She's a talented architect, being positioned to replace me once the Simone family has finished extracting everything valuable from my reputation and technique. She's been told she'll take over my projects, my clients, my professional relationships." Bethany stood up and walked out of the auditorium, her face burning with shame and fury. Good. Let her understand she was part of something ugly. Georgia played the audio recording then, Lillian and Andrew discussing extraction strategy, maximizing usefulness, ensuring complete appropriation before replacement. Their voices filled the auditorium, casual and cruel, reducing Georgia's life to a resource management problem. The silence afterward was absolute. She advanced to a video compilation next, Andrew at various industry events over the past years, accepting praise for work Georgia had designed. Clips of him being interviewed about restoration philosophy he'd learned from listening to her, techniques he'd watched her develop, innovations he'd observed her creating. In each clip, he allowed the interviewer to assume he was the primary creative force. In several, Bethany stood beside him, positioned as his collaborative partner. Georgia's replacement already being publicly introduced before Georgia herself had been informed she was being discarded. "Here's what I want you to understand," Georgia said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This wasn't just professional theft. This was a marriage built on extraction. I was recruited because Andrew's father had created an inheritance structure requiring proof of architectural success that Andrew couldn't achieve with his own limited abilities. They became the solution to someone else's inadequacy, and when I'd served that purpose, I was to be systematically erased and replaced with someone more manageable." She clicked to her final slides, side-by-side comparisons of her technique versus traditional Simone family methods, demonstrating clearly that her innovations bore no resemblance to their historic approaches. Expert testimony confirming her techniques were revolutionary and entirely her own creation. Financial analysis showing how her work had increased the company's value by millions, while her name was simultaneously being minimized. "I'm withdrawing all my work from Simone Company affiliation," she announced. "I'm accepting an independent commission with the Spanish Royal Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm establishing my reputation separately from any institutional claim. And I'm making very clear to everyone in this room and everyone watching the live stream that architectural genius cannot be transferred through marriage or stolen through systematic erasure." She looked directly at Andrew for the first time since taking the stage. "Marriage should mean building something together. But you can't build anything real on stolen ground. You can't love someone and simultaneously dispossess them. You can't claim partnership while executing extraction strategy. And I refuse to participate in my own disappearance anymore." She paused, letting the words land. The sustainable restoration technique being marketed as the Simone method is mine. The innovations revolutionizing historic preservation are mine. The vision transforming how we think about honoring the past while building sustainable futures is mine. And I'm taking it all back, every piece of work that came from my mind and my hands, because I finally understand that some thefts can only be stopped by destroying everything the thief built on stolen ground. She clicked to her final slide. "Architecture is about building things that last, but you cannot build anything real on stolen ground. The auditorium erupted. Some people stood immediately, applause thundering through the space. Others sat frozen, trying to process the devastation they'd just witnessed. Journalists were already typing, posting, streaming the story to professional networks and mainstream media. Georgia walked off stage while Andrew sat paralyzed, his mother's grip on his arm the only thing keeping him from collapsing entirely. She didn't look back. Didn't need to see his face to know that everything he'd built on her stolen work was crumbling, that the reputation he'd cultivated was imploding in real time, that the inheritance he'd needed her to secure was now tainted by the very public revelation of how he'd achieved it. Valentina met her backstage, eyes bright with fierce approval. That was magnificent, and career-defining in ways you probably don't realize yet. You didn't just reclaim your work, you created precedent. Every woman architect who's been erased, credited as an assistant, had her innovations appropriated by powerful men or legacy institutions, now has language for what happened to them. You gave them vocabulary. Georgia's hands were shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only exhaustion and the terrible knowledge that she'd just detonated her entire life. I destroyed my marriage. Your marriage was already destroyed. You just refused to keep living in the ruins, pretending they were still a home. Georgia's phone was vibrating constantly, messages, calls, emails flooding in. She turned it off. Whatever came next could wait. For now, she needed to stand backstage in a converted warehouse in Copenhagen and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd torn down everything Andrew had tried to build on her bones, and she had absolutely no idea what she'd build in its place. Chapter 7. The Demolition. The symposium presentation went viral before Georgia even left the building. Someone in the audience had live-streamed it, and within hours the video was spreading across architecture communities, professional networks, mainstream news outlets covering women's rights and workplace exploitation. Georgia became a symbol overnight, not just of stolen creative work, but of women whose genius is appropriated by powerful men who mistake proximity for ownership. The story had everything: betrayal, institutional corruption, dramatic public revelation, and evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. By the next morning, the Simone Company was hemorrhaging contracts. 3 major commissions were suspended, pending ethics investigations. Partnership inquiries evaporated. The American Institute of Architects launched formal proceedings examining whether Andrew had violated professional standards regarding attribution and credit. Georgia watched it unfold from her hotel room, simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. She'd wanted to destroy his lies. She hadn't fully considered what it would feel like to watch the destruction spread beyond her control, consuming everything in its path. Iris called from Boston. The response is overwhelming. We have 6 law firms offering to represent you pro bono, 15 architectural organizations offering formal support, and more media requests than we can possibly manage. You've become the face of creative rights and attribution justice. I don't want to be a symbol. I just wanted people to know what he did. Too late. You are a symbol whether you want it or not. The question is whether you're going to use that platform or let it use you. Georgia chose to use it. She gave interviews, spoke about systematic credit theft, explained how institutions often appropriate individual genius while claiming it serves the larger legacy. She made very clear that this wasn't just about her marriage. It was about every architect, artist, designer whose work had been stolen by people with more power and better lawyers. The personal cost arrived 3 days after the symposium. Andrew appeared at her hotel, looking hollowed and desperate. Hotel security called before allowing him up, and Georgia almost refused the visit. But something, curiosity, residual attachment, the need to see his face when confronted with consequences, made her agree. He entered her room like a man walking into hostile territory, every movement careful and defensive. "You destroyed everything," he said. "No greeting, no pretense of civility. I exposed everything. There's a difference. You humiliated me publicly, made me look like a thief and a liar in front of everyone who matters in our field. You are a thief and a liar. I just made sure everyone else knew what I'd discovered." He moved to the window, staring out at Copenhagen's historic architecture. "I gave you opportunities you never would have had without the Simone name. I opened doors, made introductions, provided resources and support that allowed you to do your best work. You provided a stage so you could steal my performance. That's not support, that's strategy. I loved you," his voice broke slightly. "I know you don't believe that now, but I did. I do." Georgia felt something twist in her chest, not sympathy exactly, but the complicated grief of watching someone you once loved reveal themselves as someone you never actually knew. "Did you ever actually love me, Andrew? Or did you just need me so desperately that you convinced yourself need was the same thing?" He turned to face her. "Does it matter? Does the distinction change anything?" "It changes everything. If you loved me, then you betrayed love. If you just needed me, then you betrayed business partnership. The scale of the crime is completely different. The scale of the destruction is the same," he shot back. "You've ruined my reputation, destroyed my company, made sure I'll never work in this field again. If that's not revenge, I don't know what is. It's not revenge. It's documentation. I showed people what you did. The ruin is just the natural consequence of your choices." They stared at each other across the hotel room. Two people who'd once shared a bed and a life and something that might have been love. Now separated by devastation, neither of them knew how to bridge. "What do you want from me?" Andrew asked finally. "An apology. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I went along with my mother's strategy. I'm sorry I let professional ambition corrupt whatever genuine feelings I had. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to resist the pressure to prove myself to a dead father who never believed I was worth the family name." "Is that enough?" "No. Then what? What do I have to do to make this right?" "Nothing. You can't make it right. You can only stop making it worse." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm suing you for defamation. My mother is funding the lawsuit. We're claiming you maliciously destroyed my reputation using misleading information taken out of context. We're going to make this so expensive and so public that you'll wish you'd just accepted the situation quietly." Georgia felt a cold calm settle over her. "Good, do it. Let's put everything in public record. Let's have forensic examination of every document, every email, every stolen attribution. Let's have experts testify about who actually created what. Let's make this as public as possible, so there's no ambiguity left about who built what on whose stolen ground." Andrew left without responding, and Georgia sat in the hotel room, feeling the full weight of what was coming. Legal battle, public scrutiny, character assassination by people with more money and institutional power than she could match. But she wasn't alone. Iris was mobilizing a legal defense. Valentina was rallying international architectural organizations. Women architects from around the world were sharing their own stories, creating a movement around the questions Georgia's revelation had raised. She returned to New York and moved into the Brooklyn apartment she'd rented under her maiden name. The space was tiny, a studio with exposed brick and inadequate heating, and windows that looked onto a brick wall rather than gardens she'd designed. But it was entirely hers. Andrew filed the lawsuit within a week. The claim was extensive: defamation, tortious interference with business relationships, breach of confidential information, and misappropriation of trade secrets. He was seeking damages that would bankrupt her, claiming her symposium presentation had destroyed his reputation and business prospects through malicious falsehood. Iris reviewed the filing and laughed. Actually laughed. "This is the best thing that could have happened. He's opening discovery to forensic examination. We get to subpoena everything, depose everyone, put every piece of evidence on public record." He just handed us the tools to destroy him even more thoroughly. He wants to make it expensive for me. Bury me in legal costs until I give up. His mother is funding this, which means we get to examine her role in the systematic erasure too. We get to show the institutional corruption, not just individual betrayal. Andrew thinks this lawsuit protects him. Actually, it's going to finish what you started in Copenhagen. The legal discovery process became its own kind of archaeology. Former Simone Company employees, given immunity, testified about being pressured to minimize Georgia's credit. Bethany Crane, furious at being publicly humiliated, provided documentation of her recruitment and training to replace Georgia. Journalists gave sworn statements about being asked to reframe articles emphasizing Andrew's leadership over Georgia's creativity. The forensic accountants traced millions in increased company value directly to Georgia's innovations and reputation, showing that the Simone Company's recent success was entirely attributable to her work, while her attribution was simultaneously being systematically reduced. Most devastatingly, Andrew himself struggled under deposition. Asked to explain the technical aspects of the estate restoration, he couldn't articulate details beyond surface-level understanding. Asked to show original design elements he'd personally created, he had nothing. Asked to defend the business development documents discussing extraction strategy, he claimed they were taken out of context, but couldn't explain what context would make discussing someone's usefulness and planned replacement acceptable. Iris asked him directly, during a deposition that would become public record, can you name a single original architectural innovation you developed during your marriage to Ms. Voll? Silence. Can you explain the technical process behind the sustainable plaster technique your company markets as the Simone method? More silence. Can you identify any creative contribution you made to the estate restoration beyond administrative and business management functions? Andrew's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The transcript would show clearly that Andrew Simone couldn't defend claims of creative authorship because he had no creative authorship to defend. The case moved toward trial, but Georgia didn't spend that time passively waiting. She accepted the Spanish Royal Trust Commission and threw herself into work that was undeniably permanently hers. The monastery restoration challenged her in ways the estate never had: more complex structural problems, stricter preservation requirements, innovations that had to honor medieval construction while incorporating modern sustainability. She worked 18-hour days, losing herself in stone and vision and the particular satisfaction of solving problems that had stumped other architects. The Royal Trust Director, Elena Ruiz, treated Georgia as a partner rather than an employee, asked questions from genuine curiosity rather than attempted control, respected expertise without feeling threatened by it. You're different than when you arrived, Elena observed one evening as they reviewed plans. Less careful, more willing to trust your own judgment. I spent years second-guessing myself because my husband made me doubt my own competence. Now I remember what it feels like to just know something is right and do it without seeking permission or approval. That's not confidence returning, Elena said. That's yourself returning. Confidence implies you might lose it again. This is just you being who you actually are, without someone trying to convince you you're someone smaller. Georgia thought about that while working late into the night, realized Eleanor was right. She wasn't becoming more confident. She was becoming less erased. The trial date approached, and Georgia flew back to New York to face whatever judgment was coming. She destroyed her marriage, demolished Andrew's reputation, exposed institutional corruption, and established precedent for creative rights and attribution. Justice. Now she'd find out if the legal system would protect her demolition or punish her for refusing to live in ruins pretending they were still a home. Chapter 8. The Foundation. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a spectacle that transcended architecture industry gossip, growing into something larger, a referendum on creative ownership, marriage power dynamics, and institutional appropriation of individual genius. The courthouse steps filled with protesters supporting Georgia. Women architects holding signs, "My work is not your inheritance, and attribution is not optional, and genius cannot be transferred through marriage." Every day brought more attention, more media coverage, more transformation of Georgia's personal devastation into something approaching movement. Inside the courtroom, the evidence was methodically presented. Iris walked the jury through Georgia's development of the sustainable plaster technique during the Philadelphia church restoration, showing dated documentation proving the innovation predated her relationship with Andrew. She presented expert testimony from preservation specialists who examined the technique and confirmed it was revolutionary, bearing no resemblance to traditional Simone family methods. The forensic accountants testified about the Simone company's financial trajectory, demonstrating that the dramatic increase in value and prestige corresponded exactly with Georgia's affiliation, and that her systematic credit reduction coincided with rising institutional profit from her appropriated reputation. Former employees testified about specific instances of being directed to minimize Georgia's attribution in promotional materials. One particularly devastating witness, a former marketing director, described receiving explicit instructions from Lillian Simone to position Andrew as the creative visionary, while Georgia was relegated to contributing team member in all company communications. Bethany Crane took the stand looking mortified and angry. Under oath, she confirmed she'd been recruited specifically to replace Georgia, that she'd been given access to Georgia's studio and work processes, that she'd been told the goal was to absorb Georgia's techniques so the company could continue profiting from them after Georgia's departure. "Did you understand you were participating in intellectual property theft?" Iris asked. "I thought I was being trained for a legitimate position," Bethany said quietly. "I didn't realize until the Copenhagen presentation that I was being positioned as Georgia's replacement using her own stolen work. If I'd understood the full context, I never would have participated." Andrew's legal team tried to argue that everything created during the marriage was collaborative work, that Georgia had benefited enormously from Simone family resources and reputation, that her public accusations constituted malicious defamation rather than legitimate revelation of professional disputes. But their case collapsed under cross-examination. Andrew couldn't articulate technical details of work he claimed to have co-created. He couldn't explain why collaborative work would require secretly documenting Georgia's processes and planning her replacement. He couldn't reconcile claims of partnership with recorded conversations discussing extraction strategy and planned transition to more manageable personnel. The moment that broke him came during Iris's cross-examination, when she played the full audio recording of Andrew and Lillian discussing Georgia's usefulness and planned replacement. The jury listened to Lillian's voice, explaining they'd extracted everything valuable from the marriage. Listened to Andrew agreeing that Georgia was becoming difficult about attribution. Listened to them laugh about her believing he actually loved her. Iris paused the recording. "Mr. Simone, in this recording you agreed with your mother that Ms. Vol had become difficult about attribution. What did you mean by that?" "She wanted her name featured more prominently in company materials. She wanted credit for work she'd actually created. She wanted individual recognition, rather than understanding that collaborative work belongs to the institution supporting it. Did you ever correct people who assumed you were the primary creative force behind projects Ms. Vol designed?" Silence. "Did you ever ensure that media coverage, award submissions, or client presentations accurately represented Ms. Vol's role as principal architect rather than contributing team member?" More silence. "Mr. Simone, when you stood beside your wife at industry events and accepted praise for work she'd designed, were you building something together, or were you stealing credit while she stood silently watching?" Objection. Andrew's attorney interjected. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge ruled. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the question, seen Andrew's inability to answer, understood the dynamics that had shaped the marriage Georgia thought was partnership, but Andrew had structured as extraction. Lillian Simone took the stand in her son's defense, regal and defensive, insisting that the Simone Company had provided Georgia with opportunities and resources she never could have accessed independently. Under cross-examination, Iris demolished that narrative systematically. Mrs. Simone, was Ms. Vole already an award-winning architect with an established reputation when your son met her? She had some recognition in regional circles. She'd won the Philadelphia Heritage Preservation Award. She'd been profiled in Architectural Digest. She'd established relationships with major preservation organizations. That's not regional recognition, that's national reputation, correct? I suppose. So when you say your company provided opportunities she couldn't have accessed independently, you mean opportunities to have her existing reputation appropriated and her established techniques claimed as institutional property? That's not what I mean at all. Then what did the Simone Company provide Ms. Vole that she didn't already possess through her own talent and reputation? Lillian couldn't answer without admitting that Georgia had provided far more value to the company than the company had provided to her. Iris presented the business development strategic plan documents, forcing Lillian to explain the extraction language, the planned transition to Bethany Crane, the timeline for maximizing Georgia's value before replacement. Mrs. Simone, in these documents, your daughter-in-law is referred to as a resource to be extracted. Is that how you viewed your son's wife? As a resource? That's corporate language taken out of context. What context makes discussing a person's extraction period and planned replacement acceptable? No answer. The trial concluded after 3 weeks of testimony. The jury deliberated for 2 days, while Georgia waited in the Spanish villa where she was living during the monastery restoration. She couldn't stay in New York, couldn't handle the reporters and protesters and attention. She needed stone walls and ancient architecture and work that mattered regardless of how the trial concluded. Iris called her late on a Tuesday afternoon. The jury reached a verdict. You need to be here tomorrow morning. Georgia flew overnight, arrived at the courthouse exhausted and terrified. The verdict would determine not just financial compensation, but validation, whether the legal system recognized what Andrew had done as theft, or dismissed it as marital discord being weaponized for revenge. The jury filed in. The foreman stood. The judge asked for the verdict, guilty on all counts brought by Georgia's countersuit. Intellectual property theft, systematic credit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty within marriage, intentional infliction of emotional distress, not guilty on Andrew's defamation claims. The jury found that Georgia's Copenhagen presentation constituted truthful revelation of professional theft, rather than malicious falsehood. The financial damages were staggering. Georgia was awarded compensation reflecting her contribution to the Simone Company's increased value, her stolen attribution, her emotional damages. The total exceeded $2 million, an amount that would require Andrew to sell the estate to satisfy the judgment. But more important than money was the precedent. The jury had established that creative work could not be claimed as marital property when one spouse had systematically stolen credit. That architectural innovation remained the intellectual property of the originating designer, regardless of where work was physically executed. That marriage did not provide license for professional exploitation. Georgia stood in the courtroom, hearing the verdict, feeling strangely empty. She'd won. She'd proven Andrew had stolen her work, exposed the systematic erasure, established legal precedent protecting other architects from similar theft. She'd destroyed his reputation and his company and his inheritance prospects. She felt no triumph, only exhaustion and grief for the years she'd spent building something on quicksand. Andrew left the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras and reporters and protesters who'd made his trial a symbol of institutional corruption. Georgia never saw him again that day, didn't need to see his face to know what she'd done to him. She'd torn down everything he'd tried to build on her stolen ground, and she genuinely didn't know if that made her an architect of justice or an architect of ruin. Perhaps, she thought, it was possible to be both simultaneously. Chapter 9. The Verdict. The trial verdict arrived on a morning when rain turned Copenhagen's streets into mirrors, reflecting medieval architecture that had survived centuries of war and weather and human folly. Georgia stood in the restored monastery, touching stone walls that had been standing when her profession was born, trying to understand that she'd actually won. Iris's voice had been steady on the phone, delivering news that should have felt like vindication, but instead felt like aftermath. The jury had ruled comprehensively in Georgia's favor. Andrew's company was ordered to publicly correct all attribution on projects she'd completed. The Simone estate would be sold to satisfy the financial judgment unless Andrew could produce the compensation through other means, which seemed unlikely given that his reputation had imploded along with his client base. "We established precedent," Iris had said, pride clear in her voice. "Every woman whose work has been stolen by powerful men, by legacy institutions, by husbands who confuse marriage with ownership, they now have legal language for what happened to them. You gave them that." Georgia had thanked her and ended the call and stood in ancient silence, trying to feel something other than hollow. The monastery restoration was nearly complete. She'd spent months solving problems that had stumped other architects, structural instability that required innovations in weight distribution, water damage that needed new approaches to material preservation, sustainability requirements that had to honor medieval construction while meeting contemporary standards. The work challenged her in ways she'd forgotten were possible, forcing her to trust her own judgment without seeking approval or second-guessing her innovations. Elena found her that afternoon, standing in the chapel Georgia had just finished restoring. "You're different today, even quieter than usual. The trial verdict came through. I won." "Then why do you look like someone grieving?" Georgia touched the restored chapel wall, feeling texture she'd preserved through months of meticulous work. "I spent 3 years married to someone who was systematically stealing from me. They destroyed him publicly, proved he was a fraud, took everything he'd built on my stolen ground. And now I'm supposed to feel victorious, but I just feel empty, like I demolished something that was already ruins. And now I'm standing in the rubble trying to remember what I thought I was building in the first place." Elena sat on the chapel bench, her presence comfortable rather than intrusive. "You know what I've learned from restoration work? Sometimes buildings are too damaged to save. The foundation is compromised, the structure is unsound, and the only responsible choice is controlled demolition before someone gets hurt. You didn't destroy a functioning marriage, you demolished ruins that were pretending to be a home. There's a difference. He might have actually loved me. That's what keeps me awake at night. Not whether he loved me, I'll never know that, but whether I destroyed someone who was capable of genuine feeling but just too broken by his own family and his own inadequacy to express it without exploitation. Does it matter? Shouldn't it matter? Shouldn't there be a difference between destroying someone genuinely malicious versus destroying someone who was just weak and desperate and corrupted by systems larger than themselves? Elena considered this carefully. The outcome is the same. Whether Andrew stole from you out of calculated malice or desperate weakness, the theft happened. Whether he loved you in some damaged way or simply needed you with intensity that felt like love, the exploitation happened. Your demolition was necessary either way. You're just grieving the possibility that you destroyed someone capable of redemption. I think I destroyed any chance he had at redemption by exposing him before he'd earned it, or you exposed him before he could hurt more people. And now redemption is his responsibility to pursue without using you as the foundation. Georgia returned to New York 3 weeks later for the final legal proceedings. The Simone Company had released corrected attribution on all her projects, restoring her name to primary architect credit on the estate restoration and acknowledging her development of the sustainable plaster technique. The corrections were pro forma and grudging, but legally binding. The estate sale was scheduled for the following month. Georgia wouldn't attend, couldn't bear to watch strangers bid on property she'd restored, gardens she'd planted, architecture she'd saved from neglect through years of sleepless dedication. Andrew reached out through attorneys, requesting a meeting to discuss settlement terms that might avoid the estate sale. Georgia refused. She didn't want his family home, wanted nothing that would tie her to his inheritance complications and his mother's lingering influence. She wanted her compensation so she could build something entirely her own, something no one could claim through marriage or appropriation or legal complexity. The meeting happened anyway, accidentally, when she went to the estate one final time to retrieve her grandmother's tools from the studio. She'd thought Andrew would be gone, but his car was in the drive, and when she entered the carriage house, he was there, standing in the space she'd designed, looking diminished and older than someone his age should look. "I thought you'd be gone," she said. "I came to pack my father's papers. The new owners take possession next week." He gestured around the space. "You designed this beautifully. I never told you that enough." "You never told me that at all." They stood in awkward silence. Two people who'd once shared intimacy, now separated by devastation, neither knew how to bridge. "I've been trying to understand what I actually felt for you," Andrew said finally, "whether it was real or just sophisticated need. My therapist says the distinction might not matter, that I was so damaged by my father's expectations and my mother's manipulation that I never learned the difference between genuine feeling and strategic performance. But I want you to know I tried. I tried to love you the way you deserved, and I failed because I didn't know how to value someone without trying to own them." Georgia felt something twist in her chest, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement of shared damage. "Did your father really create that inheritance structure requiring you to prove yourself?" "Yes, he thought I was worthless, and he designed his will to make sure I'd spend years proving him right. When I met you, I thought I'd found salvation, someone brilliant enough to make me look competent by association. I convinced myself I loved you because I needed you so desperately that need felt indistinguishable from love. And now I'm teaching community college architecture courses, living in a tiny apartment, working with a therapist to figure out if there's an actual person underneath all the performance and desperation. I lost everything, the estate, the company, my reputation, my mother's respect. The only thing I gained is the possibility of figuring out who I actually am, without inheritance pressure and institutional expectations." "I hope you figure it out," Georgia said, and meant it despite everything. "I hope you learn to create something real with your own hands, to value someone else's gifts without needing to steal their light." What you did in Copenhagen, the trial, the public exposure, it was devastating. But it was also necessary. I would have kept stealing from you, kept diminishing you, kept extracting until there was nothing left to take. You stopped me by making continuation impossible. I demolished you. You demolished what I'd built on your stolen work. There's a difference. What I lost was always yours to begin with. They didn't hug or find closure or exchange forgiveness. They simply acknowledged the wreckage between them and walked away in different directions. Andrew toward whatever diminished future awaited someone whose reputation had been deservedly destroyed. Georgia toward the Spanish Commission and work that was undeniably hers. 3 months later, Georgia received a call from a hospice facility in Westchester. Lillian Simone had suffered a massive stroke and was dying. She'd asked specifically to speak with Georgia. Georgia almost refused. This woman had orchestrated the theft of her work, the corruption of her marriage, the systematic erasure of her identity. She owed Lillian nothing, except perhaps the satisfaction of knowing her institutional protection had failed. Her son had been exposed. Her legacy had crumbled. But Valentina, visiting Georgia in Spain, said something that shifted her perspective. Forgiveness isn't about absolving someone else. It's about releasing yourself from continuing to carry their weight. You don't have to forgive her, but perhaps you need to witness the end of what tried to destroy you, to see that it failed. Georgia flew to New York. The hospice was modest. Andrew had clearly downgraded his mother's care to something their devastated finances could manage. Lillian lay diminished in the bed, the formidable matriarch reduced to a frail figure struggling with each breath. Lillian dismissed the nurse, leaving them alone. "You came," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think you would. I almost didn't. I need you to understand something before I die. I spent my entire life as guardian of Simone legacy, convinced that protecting the institutional name was the only thing that mattered. I married into the family young, devoted myself to maintaining their architectural reputation, raised my son to value heritage over everything, including authenticity. When my husband died and left an inheritance structure designed to prove Andrew was worthless, I saw it as judgment, his final condemnation of my failure to raise a son worthy of our name." She paused, struggling to breathe. "So I found you. Or rather, I found that Andrew had found you, this brilliant architect desperate for belonging after her mother died, and I turned you into a resource. I orchestrated your systematic erasure, planned your replacement, convinced myself it was necessary for the institution. I destroyed you to protect something that was already hollow. Why are you telling me this? Because watching you fight back, refusing to be erased, standing on that Copenhagen stage and reclaiming your work with such devastating precision, that was the first time I'd seen someone embody what I'd spent my life pretending the Simones represented. Real power, actual genius, legitimate legacy earned through talent rather than protected through manipulation and theft." Lillian's hand moved weakly on the hospital blanket. "You were everything I claimed we were, and I destroyed you because you made it clear how hollow we actually were. I taught Andrew that legacy was something you protected rather than something you earned, that worth could be inherited rather than created. I made him into a beautiful, hollow man who didn't know how to love someone without trying to own them. And then I convinced him to do to you what I'd done to him, extract everything valuable and leave nothing but emptiness. Did he ever really love me? I don't know. I don't think he knows. I taught him to confuse need with love, utility with devotion, performance with authentic feeling. When you met, he needed you desperately. Did that need become love? Or did he simply perform love so convincingly that even he believed it? I destroyed my son's ability to answer that question, which means I destroyed your marriage before it even began." Silence filled the room, heavy with confession and the particular weight of terminal honesty. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Lillian said. "I'm asking you to understand that some corruption runs so deep it destroys everything it touches, including the people trying to protect something that was never worth protecting in the first place. The Simone legacy was always more impressive from a distance than up close. You were real. We were just pretending." Georgia sat with that for a long time. "What do you want me to do with this information?" "Build something real. Build something that doesn't require stealing other people's genius to maintain the illusion of greatness. Build something that earns its reputation rather than inherits it. And when people tell your story, make sure they understand the difference between demolition and destruction. You didn't destroy my son. You demolished the false structure he'd built on your stolen ground. There's a difference, and it matters." Lillian died 2 days later. Georgia attended the funeral, watching Andrew stand beside the casket, looking lost and diminished. They didn't speak. Nothing left to say that wouldn't just be additional wreckage between them. She returned to Spain, to the monastery, and Elena and work that was healing her in ways she hadn't expected. The restoration was nearly complete, and the Royal Trust had offered her a multi-year commission to restore a series of historic properties across the country. She said yes. She was ready to build something lasting on ground she owned completely, using techniques that belonged to no one except herself. Creating work that would bear her name because she'd earned it through sleepless nights and innovations no one could steal. The past couldn't be changed. The damage couldn't be undone, but the future could be built deliberately, carefully, on foundations that wouldn't crumble when examined closely. Georgia stood in the completed monastery chapel, sunlight streaming through windows she'd preserved, stone walls that would stand centuries after everyone involved was dust, and thought about the difference between being someone's architect of success versus being the architect of your own life. She'd spent years building monuments to someone else's ego. Now she built for herself, for history, for young women, architects who needed to see that genius cannot be stolen if you refuse to surrender it. The foundation was solid this time. Everything built on it would last. Chapter 10 was the architecture of forgiveness. Georgia stood in her Madrid apartment balcony on a morning when spring made everything new, looking at the city spread before her like a blueprint, waiting for the right architect to understand its potential. She'd been living in Spain for nearly 2 years, building a career so undeniably hers that no one could question authorship, creating innovations that bore her name because she'd earned that recognition through work no one else could have accomplished. The Spanish Royal Trust Commission had expanded beyond initial expectations. She'd restored 6 historic properties, developed new preservation techniques being studied internationally, trained younger architects in methodologies that honored both traditional craftsmanship and contemporary sustainability. Her name appeared in architectural journals, not as someone's wife or institutional team member, but as Georgia Voll, principal architect, revolutionary preservation specialist, voice for creative rights and attribution justice. She'd rebuilt herself from foundation stones of her own worth, and the structure was holding. The call about Lillian came on a Tuesday. Georgia answered without checking the number. Heard Andrew's voice for the first time in months. Felt something in her chest respond that wasn't quite pain but wasn't quite indifference either. "My mother is dying," he said without preamble. "Hospice says maybe days. She asked for you specifically." Georgia should have refused. This woman had orchestrated her systematic erasure, had viewed her as a resource to be extracted and discarded. But something in Andrew's voice, exhaustion maybe, or the particular defeat that comes from watching your last parent die, made her pause. Why would she want to see me? "I don't know." "She won't tell me. She just keeps saying she needs to talk to you before it's too late." "Andrew, I can't just drop everything and fly to New York because the woman who tried to destroy my career wants a deathbed conversation." "I'm not asking you to do it for her. I'm asking because—" He stopped, voice breaking slightly. "I'm asking because I think she has something to say that you need to hear. Not for closure. Not for her peace of mind. For you." Georgia almost said no, almost hung up and returned to her work and let Lillian Simone die without witnessing the end of what had tried to destroy her. But Valentina's words echoed, "Sometimes you need to witness the end to understand it actually ended." She flew to New York the next day. The hospice facility was small and quiet, nothing like the grand Simone estate where Lillian had ruled for decades. Andrew met her in the lobby, looking older than someone his age should look, wearing clothes that weren't quite right, slightly too loose, slightly too worn, the particular appearance of someone who'd stopped caring about impressions people formed. "Thank you for coming," he said. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either. They walked to Lillian's room in silence. That felt less hostile than simply empty. Two people who'd once built something together, discovering that nothing remained except acknowledgement. Of wreckage, Lillian looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Georgia had only ever seen her commanding rooms and conversations, using institutional authority like a weapon to shape reality according to Simone family interests. This diminished figure barely resembled that woman. Georgia. Lillian's voice was thread-thin. You came. I came. Sit, please. Lillian gestured weakly toward the chair beside her bed. Andrew moved to leave, but his mother stopped him. Stay. You need to hear this too. Georgia sat, keeping distance between herself and the dying woman, not from cruelty, but from self-preservation. She'd learned that proximity to Simone family dynamics required careful boundaries. What followed wasn't apology. Lillian didn't beg forgiveness or claim remorse that felt performative. Instead, she offered something more valuable, complete honesty from someone with nothing left to lose. She explained her whole life, marrying into the Simone family young, devoting herself to maintaining their architectural reputation, raising Andrew to value legacy above everything, including authentic feeling. She described Thomas Simone's final cruelty, creating an inheritance structure designed to prove his son worthless. She confessed orchestrating Georgia's systematic erasure, planning her replacement, convincing herself it was necessary to protect institutional heritage. But watching you fight back, Lillian said, struggling with each breath, standing on that stage in Copenhagen and reclaiming your work with such precision. That was the first time I'd seen someone embody what I'd spent my life pretending we represented. Real power earned reputation. Genius that didn't require theft to maintain. You destroyed me to protect something hollow, Georgia said quietly. Yes, and I destroyed my son by teaching him that legacy was something to protect rather than earn, that worth could be inherited rather than created. I made him into someone who couldn't distinguish between loving you and needing you because I never taught him the difference between authentic feeling and strategic performance. Andrew stood against the wall, tears streaming silently down his face. Lillian turned her fading attention to him. You asked me once if you ever really loved Georgia. I told you I didn't know. That was a lie. You loved her. I saw it in how you watched her work, how you listened when she explained her vision, how you softened around her in ways you never softened around me or your father. But I taught you that loving someone meant owning them, that partnership meant extraction, that marriage was another form of inheritance to be managed. I corrupted whatever genuine feeling you had by making you believe it required control. Mother, please, Andrew's voice broke. No, you need to hear this. Both of you. Georgia, my son loved you in the only way I taught him how, by trying to possess what he admired, to own what he valued, to extract what he needed, rather than honoring what you offered freely. That's not your fault or even entirely his. That's generational corruption passing from me to him, from my husband to me, from the Simone family legacy that valued institutional reputation over human authenticity. Lillian's breath grew more labored. Georgia leaned forward instinctively, some ancient human impulse to witness death properly, even when the dying person had tried to destroy you. Build something real, Lillian whispered. Build something that doesn't require theft or corruption or systematic erasure to maintain. Build something worthy of your actual talent rather than stolen reputation. And when people tell your story, make sure they understand you didn't destroy Andrew. You demolished the false structure he'd built on your stolen ground. There's a difference. It matters. She died the next morning with Andrew beside her, holding the hand of a woman who taught him everything except how to be an authentic person, capable of loving someone without destroying them in the process. Georgia attended the funeral, stood in the small chapel watching Andrew say goodbye to his last parent, understanding that he was now entirely alone in ways that went beyond not having family. He was alone, with the understanding that he'd been corrupted by systems larger than himself, that he'd destroyed the one relationship that might have saved him, that redemption would require years of work with no guarantee of success. Afterward, they spoke briefly in the cemetery, standing among headstones marking generations of Simons who'd built their reputation on protecting legacy rather than earning it. "What will you do now?" Georgia asked. "Keep teaching. Keep working with my therapist. Keep trying to figure out who I actually am underneath all the performance and corruption." He looked at her with something approaching clarity. "I loved you. I don't know if I loved you well or correctly or in ways that honored your gifts rather than exploited them. But I loved you in whatever damaged way I was capable of loving. That doesn't excuse what I did, doesn't change the theft or the systematic erasure or the planned replacement. But I need you to know it wasn't entirely hollow." Georgia felt unexpected tears threatening. "That might be the saddest thing I've ever heard. That you loved me and still destroyed me because you didn't know how to do both simultaneously." "I'm learning. Too late for us, but maybe in time to avoid destroying anyone else." "I hope so, Andrew. I genuinely hope you figure out how to value someone without needing to own them." They parted without touching. Two people who'd once been intimate, now separated by devastation that couldn't be bridged through simple acknowledgement or deathbed confessions. Georgia returned to Spain, to Elena, and work that was healing her in ways she hadn't expected. The Royal Trust had offered her direction of their entire preservation program, a position that would establish her as one of the most influential restoration architects in Europe. She accepted. That evening, she stood in the completed monastery chapel, sunlight streaming through windows she'd preserved, stone walls that had survived centuries of human folly and would survive centuries more. She thought about Andrew, about whether he'd loved her, about whether the distinction between damaged love and sophisticated need actually mattered when the outcome was identical. She thought about Lillian's deathbed confession, about generational corruption that taught people to confuse ownership with partnership, extraction with collaboration, theft with love. She thought about the years she'd spent building monuments to someone else's ego, allowing herself to be erased because she'd been desperate for belonging and family and purpose after her mother's death, and she thought about everything she'd built since, work that bore her name because she'd earned it, innovations that changed how people thought about preservation, techniques being studied and celebrated and attributed correctly because she'd refused to be disappeared. A year later, Georgia met Miguel at an academic conference on sustainable restoration. He was a historian who studied the building she restored, who admired her work without needing to possess it, who understood that loving someone meant witnessing their brilliance and stepping back to let it shine rather than dimming it to make himself feel larger. They built something together, slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and explicit communication, and the understanding that partnership required both people maintaining their own foundation rather than trying to build on each other's ground. On their wedding day, small and quiet in the restored monastery chapel, Georgia's friend Iris asked if she'd ever forgiven Andrew. "No," Georgia said. "Forgiveness implies absolution, and I don't absolve what he did. But I released it. I stopped carrying the weight of his betrayal because it was interfering with everything I was building. That's not forgiveness. That's structural necessity. You can't build anything stable while carrying someone else's wreckage. What about the years you lost?" Not lost, excavated. I learned things about institutional corruption, about systematic erasure, about how desperation can corrupt genuine feeling until people can't distinguish between loving someone and needing them. I learned that legacy built on theft will always crumble when examined closely. And I learned that the most important architecture you'll ever create is the foundation of your own worth, constructed alone if necessary, bearing your name without apology, built to last long after everyone who tried to take it has been forgotten. 10 years after Copenhagen, Georgia received the International Design Excellence Award. By then, she'd restored 23 historic properties, developed preservation techniques being used globally, trained hundreds of young architects in methods that honored both tradition and innovation. She'd become what she'd always been underneath the Simone name, an architect whose genius needed no institutional affiliation to prove its worth. She accepted the award in the same auditorium where she demolished Andrew's reputation, standing on the same stage where she'd reclaimed her work through devastating public truth-telling. This time, there was no controversy, no systematic erasure to expose, no betrayal to document, just recognition for work that was undeniably, permanently hers. In her acceptance speech, she talked about the difference between inherited reputation and earned achievement, between institutional legacy and individual genius, between building something that requires constant protection from examination and building something that grows stronger when scrutinized closely. Architecture teaches us that foundations matter more than facades, she concluded, that structures built on stolen ground will eventually collapse, that the most important work we do isn't the buildings we restore, but the boundaries we maintain, the authenticity we protect, and the refusal to be anything less than wholly ourselves. Some people will try to steal your light to illuminate their own darkness. Your job isn't to forgive them. Your job is to keep shining so brightly that theft becomes impossible. She left the stage to thunderous applause, walked past the seat where Andrew had once sat, watching her demolish him, and felt nothing except profound gratitude that she'd torn down ruins pretending to be a home before they'd collapsed and buried her completely. The foundation she'd built since was solid. Everything constructed on it would last, and her name, Georgia Voll, architect, innovator, survivor of systematic erasure who refused to be erased, would be on every stone.